Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'll just give people a moment to join and we'll get started in a minute or two. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I can see that more people are joining us, so we'll get started in a moment or two to give everyone a chance to log in. Thank you. Right, let's get started. My name is Ben Miller, and I'll be hosting tonight's session. This is our second technical webinar. It was on the subject of peatland restoration and moorland protection. Last week, we hosted a session on noise and shadow flicker, and the recording for that is available on our website. Before I hand over to colleagues to introduce themselves, I wanted to outline the format that we'll follow this evening. Firstly, we'll have a presentation from the team on the technical details of the topics that we're covering, and then that will be followed by a question and answer session. For those that have not attended a webinar previously, you're able to submit your questions using the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your screen. Please do get your questions in as we go through the presentation so that once we've completed, we can move on to the questions. This is a technical webinar this evening. Of course, we're more than happy to answer any general questions about the scheme that you might have. But other technical questions not related to peatland restoration, we'll have to take those away and take them to the wider team. I'll now hand over to the team we have this evening to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Pete.
Thanks, Ben. Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Rowe. I'm a development manager at Cubico. That means I'm the sort of day-to-day project lead for the Scoutmore 2 project. In terms of Cubico, we're a UK headquartered renewables company. That means we own, operate, and develop wind farms and solar farms across the UK and beyond. Just really want to say that public consultation's sort of really important to us as a business and to me personally. We're looking forward to sort of introducing you to the team that have been working on our sort of moorland restoration proposals tonight. And yeah, hopefully you find it a good way to get across a bit more of the detail about our plans, which we feel is a really exciting part of the scheme. Hand over to, is it Andy next?
Hi there, good evening. My name's Andy Mills. I work for OWC and I'm a peatland geomorphologist, and I've worked across Scotland, England and Wales on wind farms in peatland environments. And I'll pass over to Duncan.
Hello, my name's Duncan Saunders. I'm a hydrogeologist with Fluid Environmental Consulting. Our role in the project is looking at the water aspects and thinking with Andy on the heat side. I've been working on wind farms across the UK for, I remember, a good 20 years.
Hi, I'm Jess Hosier. I'm a principal ecologist at Atmos Consulting, and I've been involved in the ecology, biodiversity and ornithology at Scoutmore.
Thank you all, and thank you everyone who's given up their time to attend tonight. We really appreciate it. As I say, please do get your questions in as we go through the presentation, and I'll hand over to Andy to get us started.
Okay, so can I just check you can see the slides?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Right, well, I'll kick off. So I guess the first thing we need to think about is the importance of peatlands and moorland habitats. Many of you may know, or you may not know, that peatlands are in the UK in particular are a key aspect of our natural environment. We have a lot of the world's blanket bog in the UK, and that's distributed throughout the 3 mainland countries, particularly extensive in Scotland, but also very widespread in the north of England and in the southwest of England and across Wales. And at the moment, and certainly for the past 10 to 15 years, the importance of peatlands has been recognised on many levels in terms of the ecosystem services that they offer. Those ecosystem services principally are the vegetation or habitats that live on top of the peat soil. The amount of carbon that's held in the peat, so essentially peat is accumulated in hillside environments and in some lowland areas over several thousand years. And all of the peat that you think of as soil holds large amounts of carbon. And peatlands also play a role in regulating water and its movement through the landscape, principally through slowing water down when it falls as rain on hill slope summits, and also in controlling water quality with good quality bogs that are in good condition, providing very valuable services and keeping water colour clearer and a consistent supply of water in drier periods. Unfortunately, peatlands have been subject to a lot of pressures over a very long period of time. That can include burning, including accidental burning and deliberate fires, which we've seen recently in the news. Artificial drainage, which has been used to try and improve the quality of peat when nobody really appreciated the ecological value of peat. Forestry, when peat was considered as a waste soil, so the only thing that anybody could really think to do with it was to put forest on top of it, and all of these different. And then there's air pollution as well, which has been a particular problem in the north of England in association with the Industrial Revolution and dieback of vegetation in areas around Manchester and elsewhere. So there have been a lot of pressures on peatlands, and there's a lot of work at present going into restoring them and improving them. So a peat bog that's in really good condition might look like the photograph you see on the right-hand side of the slide here. In terms of what this peat looks like close up, if you don't tend to wander into the depths of the bogs, it's very wet, typically below the ground surface. It holds a lot of water. The water doesn't move through that peat consistently like a sponge. A lot of the water is held in there for very, very long periods. Most of the water movement in peat happens at the top in the vegetation. And that's the bit that actually soaks the water up and supplies the hydrological functionality to the peat. Inevitably, wind farms are located in areas where peat is often quite prevalent because the windiest parts of the UK tend to be at the top of the hills, and the top of the hills tend to be the cooler, wetter parts of the landscape. So there's been a pressure for a long time from wind farms on peatland areas, and the balance between achieving a good design and delivering ecosystem benefits alongside development is something that the UK wind industry has a lot of expertise in and has been delivering for at least 20, 30 years now. So I'm going to pass on in a moment to look at the sorts of information that we collect on peat bogs when we think about how to develop them, and I'll kick that off with Duncan, looking at peat depth.
So one of the key elements that we're looking at on sites is to define the depth of peat across the site. So the objective can then be one of avoiding any areas of peat in the first instance, and particularly deep peat as a priority. So to enable us to do that, we undertake peat depth probing, where we insert a fiberglass rod into the ground until we get refusal, and that depth is in peatland areas is consistent with the depth of peat. This is also verified on the ground with coring to confirm that the depth is consistent with peat. So the initial probing across the site is on a 100-metre grid basis to understand the broad occurrence of peat across the site. Once we've collected all this data, we then undertake an interpolation of that, so we can get a clear understanding of how the peat depth varies. So you can see on the scale on the bottom left, that anything less than 0.3 metres in depth is not defined as peat, and that's your yellow coloration across the site there. And then in increments of you can see up to 0.5 across shallow peat, and then everything above 0.5. We've got half-metre intervals there showing how it increases. So there's an understanding there based on this broad coarse grid of how the depth varies. Then, as we look to try and develop a layout, target the probing to a higher density around areas of infrastructure. What we're trying to do there is really define how the peak depth varies in these areas, and that's required for two elements. One is because we want to avoid as much peat as possible, so we're looking to really define it so we can move and adjust infrastructure carefully, and then it also enables us to have a very accurate measurement of how much peat will be excavated during the construction period. So we've got a clear understanding of how much peat is coming out of each element of the layout, and then we can have a plan of exactly how to manage that. I'm passing on to Jess.
Thank you. So as part of our baseline habitat surveys, we undertook both a UK habitat survey, which is required for biodiversity net gain calculations, and a National Vegetation Classification Survey, or MVC. So the MVC survey is a much more detailed method of surveying, and it results in much more granular and accurate habitat mapping. So you can see this in the figure here. So as you can see, most of the site was classified as Maya or M communities, which are peatland habitats. The survey found that a large amount of this Maya habitat was degraded and in poor condition, with areas of high quality habitat present in small pockets across the site. I think we've got an image now to show you those areas with those pockets. So you can see the darker coloured pink pockets, which are our nicer habitat, and the rest of the lighter shaded purple are our areas of degraded peatland. So using the results from our MVC survey, along with information on the condition of the peatland, we are able to focus on the most degraded areas of the site for restoration, focusing the scope of our restoration and enhancement plans. This essentially means that we've been able to build a restoration plan that focuses on these areas to restore and enhance the peatland to the condition it once was.
So the third part of that, thanks Jess, is combining the peat depth information that Duncan referred to and the ecological information that Jess has referred to try and understand the areas of the site that are in poorest condition and therefore are most amenable to restoration, and the parts of the sites that might be in good condition that we want to link to some of the restored areas. So again, here's the aerial photograph of the site superimposed on an elevation model. So hopefully you can see a little bit of sort of the landscape shape there. And there's a few photos here of the sorts of things that have affected the site. So if we first set of photos are focused primarily on the west of the site where actually the deepest peat is located. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the extensive quarrying activity that has industrial heritage value in the north of the site. You can see the strong patterning on the ground around the bog. And this is formed of all of the groundworks that were done to move lots of rock around the area. So this is actually quite an extensive area of disturbance, and the quarrying has led to a retreat of the bog away from its former boundaries, which can actually be seen on historical maps of the site. The main peat deposit in the centre of this plateau in the west is dissected by these gully features. So you can see linear features extending from the edges, and these look like this. This is one of the gullies on the site. It has a steep vertical sidewall, well, a vertical sidewall of peat, which is currently exposed to the air, which means it's oxidizing and losing carbon. And the base of the gully is eroding through the passage of water. And over time, what you tend to find is gullies become wider and collapse. And then the material that collapses is washed through, becomes steep again, it's eroded again, and it collapses. And so the gullies become wider unless there's remedial work done to improve them. In other areas where vegetation has been lost through potentially air pollution and combined effects of that and grazing, you can get shallow patches of peat loss, which expose the underlying geology. So here you can see on the bottom left image, rocks and weathered material that's underneath the peat that's been exposed where the peat has been lost. And that's quite widespread in the southwest part of the site. Equally, there are large sort of areas of thinning vegetation with bare peat quite visible through, thinner vegetation or in actually quite large patches. So you can see this up on the top right, and quite often you'll see evidence of grazing and hooves, and which is called poaching when it's in soil, as opposed to poaching catching a pheasant. And this is the sort of damage you can get in association with stock, but also with vehicle use, just general walking over sensitive soils. And then finally, in the east of the site, although the vegetation cover is very intact, the quality of the vegetation and its value in continuing to allow peat to accumulate is actually quite low. So this is a Molinia-dominated portion of the site where there are long grasses, very tussocky, not a lot of bog mosses, and the bog mosses are the things that help peat accumulate and help peat hold water. And they actually have quite high fuel load for fires, and it's typically these sorts of grassy bog surfaces that are more susceptible to fires if they can't be re-wetted. And so part of the proposals that we're putting in place in association with the wind farm are to try and re-wet some of these areas and bring some of the wetter species back to this site. In terms of using the information, I'm going to move this toolbar. I think it might be in the way of some of the words. There we go. In terms of how we design the site using all that information that we've just presented, there's essentially a 5-step process. So first off, we undertake surveys right at the beginning of the project to try and identify the best quality areas of the site. So in this case, the habitats and the deepest peat, so the 2 maps we showed earlier. And what we're trying to do is follow the mitigation hierarchy. And the mitigation hierarchy is initially to avoid. So where at all possible, we avoid peat, we avoid habitats. But turbines need to be spaced, but they have to have certain spacings in order to avoid turbulence. And there are other constraints that aren't to do with peat that we have to consider. So viewpoints, birds, other infrastructure, and watercourses. So the site has to be designed taking into account all of those constraints. Once we've got an initial layout, we then try and minimize the impacts of specific infrastructure in general locations by moving it around. So the image you can see here is a simplified version of the peat depth map that Duncan showed earlier, where we have yellow for the soil and purple for the peat. And you can see 2 different alignments of infrastructure here, where the old infrastructure, when the design was quite simple and dark, in a sort of dark color, goes over a very deep peat area in the middle of the square. And then the infrastructure alignment is rotated and the track is moved so that it doesn't go through the deep peat area. And those sorts of decisions are made all the time, continuously through the project design process. Once we've got a layout that we're satisfied has minimized the impact insofar as possible, we then look to mitigate the impact in the places where we can't avoid them. And mitigation might be through good construction design, so avoiding excavating peat and floating a road as an alternative. So that's where you put a road that sits on top of the peat, settles slightly, but doesn't involve excavation. And we might look at how when we look at excavating peat and moving it around, how best to do that so that it stays wet, is able to maintain its habitat. And ultimately there isn't a net loss of material from the site. And then we'll do other things like looking at translocating habitats, other bits and pieces. And then finally, on top of the mitigation, which we do to try and minimize our impacts, we also undertake offsetting or compensation, which is where we push out a much wider restoration plan to go above and beyond the worst case impacts that we've assessed in the EIA. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So I'll pass back to Duncan to talk about one of the ways we look at minimizing and mitigating impacts.
Yeah, so the idea on this slide really is to state that it isn't just during the design phase for EIA that we're looking at minimization of peat disturbance. It goes through into the construction phase as well. Once we're on site, more detailed investigations will be undertaken, and there'll be more investigation into other elements of the site we can float. Is it just the roads? Other parts of the infrastructure we can float? Can we look at avoiding excavating peat through piling, peat displacement methods, or can we do some reassembling of some of the components that mean we don't need quite as extensive footprints on the hard standings? So again, minimising peat disturbance, all of those will be looked at subsequently, as well as we have to try and get the best design possible for minimising peat disturbance. On the right hand side, you can see just this really gives an impression of
So in terms of restoration methods, this is really dealing with the sort of offsetting element after the mitigation that Duncan's been talking about. There are a range of relatively established or traditional restoration methods that where available for a site we can utilize, and this site has both artificial drainage and plenty of gullies, and that thankfully methods to restore those areas have been in use for getting on well over a decade now, and are well published, and there's a lot of good practitioners. So I'll briefly discuss this because we did, I think, cover this in the actual exhibitions. One of the chief techniques that's used in peat bogs is drain blocking. So where drains are in place, essentially you bring you use a variety of methods to block them, including bringing peat in from the edges of the drains into the centre. And what that does is it stops water being lost from the site quickly through the drain network. And that's usually pretty reliable and widely practiced. Similarly, gullies, which are just wider, deeper versions of drains, can also be blocked. If they're narrow enough to be dammed, that can be undertaken. If they're too wide to be dammed, they can be reprofiled so that the eroding bare surfaces on either side that I showed a photograph of earlier are no longer oxidizing and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And also, once they're flatter, so they're smooth and slopey rather than vertical, they can sustain vegetation much better as well. And both of these things are very beneficial. There's a lot of publications on the benefits of these. Finally, we can use peat for patch repair. So inevitably, we'll have to dig some peat up here and there, and peat can essentially be taken from one location and put into another. And providing the catatelmic peat, which is the deep peat that looked wet on that photo I showed very early on, has the vegetation placed on over the top of it. And that can be done with the bucket of an excavator and by a skilled contractor very, very well. Then essentially, effectively, you're moving peat with no carbon loss from one area to another, and you're reinstating vegetation so that there's ultimately no net loss of carbon or vegetation through that process. So those are the sort of conventional ways of doing things. On top of that, there are other more innovative techniques that have only been applied more recently. So the quick wins in peatland restoration in the UK generally have revolved around drain blocking and gully restoration. There are large areas of bog in the UK that essentially have had a slow shift of vegetation from bog species that are generally associated with peat accumulating, which is what has happened for the last few thousand years, and peat it being in stasis, so neither losing nor accumulating any more peat. And in these areas where we've got purple moorgrass and at the expense of bog mosses, the function of the bog's not as good. It's not really accumulating anymore, and there are other related issues like fire risk, which I mentioned earlier. This is actually quite difficult to manage. It can be managed to an extent with grazing, so changing the animals that are grazing on a particular area. But really the thing that needs to be done is to try and get the bog mosses back in and try and reduce the prevalence of Molinia. And Moors for the Future, who are a conservation body working in the north of England, have put an awful lot of work into a variety, well, really most of the restoration techniques that are now being applied across the UK, and recently have been undertaking trials in trying to reduce the extent of Molinia and increase the extent of sphagnum. And they've had some success down the road, by which I mean the M62, in other bogs relatively local to the area where they've been undertaking these restoration methods, and we're looking to draw from their experience. Other things that we can do is move peat on a larger scale. So on this site, you'll see that the hashed blue line is the extent of the bog as it was mapped on 1850s Ordnance Survey maps. And having used Ordnance Survey maps, historical maps for a long time, it's amazing how accurate they were, even when they didn't have satellites, aerial photographs, and electronic survey equipment. So this is the extent of the old bog as mapped, and the extent of the bog as it currently stands is the thick dark blue line that you see here. So it's retreated heavily, largely in response to quarry work. But it will continue to retreat as these gullies expand if work isn't done to try and arrest their movement. There is actually a lovely area of good quality bog, which Jess highlighted on one of the earlier images, which is this area where my mouse is waving. Hopefully you can see that, I don't know. One of the things we're looking to do is to try and reconnect that piece of bog, which is high quality, to the wider bog by putting some of the peat into this area, which will require quite a bit of groundwork, but is a really good use of peat in this area. It'll be a big, extensive area of peat that will connect the two pieces of bog together. So that's an opportunity that we're looking at in that area. In terms of, if you wanted to read more about the success of restoration in the UK as a whole, the Nature Scott Peatland Action Technical Compendium was published last February and compiles about 10 years of good practice experience in a range of restoration activities in relatively easy to read web format there. And again, Moors for the Future have produced a page worth, so the entire slide here could be covered with these guidance documents that they've produced to support practitioners in restoring bogs. And a lot of their work is very much Northern England focused, although it has been used much more widely. So there's the reason that's important is because the climate of the north of England is different to the climate of the east of Scotland, which is different to the climate of the west of Wales. And sometimes it's important to undertake methods that are relevant to the local area. And there are published papers in the public domain that are freely accessible, so no paywall to get to these, where you can look at how these methods are working, and see that university researchers and others are putting this together and making it work. In case you're wondering whether wind farms have played a beneficial role, the Black Law Wind Farm, which is a Scottish power renewable site up in Scotland, in North Lanarkshire, developed many of the forest to bog restoration techniques that are now used in forest to bog restoration across Scotland and Wales. And they trialled numerous techniques there, and the restoration community freely admits that a lot of good work was done there that's now being applied in non-wind farm contexts. So wind does play a part in innovating to improve bog conditions in the UK. And so much so, in fact, that the IUCN, which is an international body, has put together a forest to bog restoration demonstrating success document, which came out last year, which just shows all of the different environments in which forest to bog restoration has worked. So I'll pass back to Duncan.
This slide very much we wanted to include to discuss the hydrological effects that are likely to occur based on both the moorland restoration and the placement of infrastructure across the site. So when we're implementing on these moorland restoration methods to improve peatland habitat, reconnect habitat, and allow a more uniform surface, really, is what we're looking for across the peatland habitat. It enables the hydrological connectivity, the water within the peat, to be much more connected, rather than having gullies cutting across the peat, which just drains the peatland either side. It dries out the peat, which then just erodes greater. If you can reprofile these and restore the gullies and reconnect the peatland habitat, then the water level within the peat rises, and you have a wetter bog, a better connected hydrological system across the peatland. and that not only stops the drying out of the peat, it also reduces that sort of particulate peat transfer into watercourses that can then end up in the public water supply reservoirs around the area. And also you have, rather than fast track pathways of rainfall falling into these areas, lots of gullies just quickly moving water off the site. It enables the site to retain water better. It can end up slowing down that sort of rainfall runoff and even reduce the peak flows in the flood events. So there's some clear benefits to doing a sort of wider peatland restoration across the site. Now, there are obviously some effects by having infrastructure with on the site as well. So when you're excavating peat, you're clearly exposing it to the environment. So there's some, needs to be really clear and specific handling and storage methods associated with the excavated peat, so that it doesn't get lost, and the same process happens. So the idea is translocate to areas assigned for peat restoration as concurrently with your excavation, and then other areas store them appropriately so that then they're available when those other temporary infrastructure areas become available for restoration, then they can go back in. Obviously with infrastructure there is a change in surface characteristics. A lot of the infrastructure areas are semi-permeable, but even so there are runoff associated with those tracks and hard standing areas. Therefore they'll need water management to make sure we haven't got that sort of sediment being dispersed across the site. So what we're looking to do is manage that, capture it, and discharge it diffusely into the surrounding habitat. So just spreading out so that it all infiltrates into, rather than into channels, it goes spreads back into the habitats and keeps those groundwater levels close to surface. So it also, you have potential with excavations and then your concrete blocks associated with the base of the turbines or excavated tracks that you can disrupt the peatland hydrology. So again, what we're looking to do, promote that hydrological continuity, make sure you've got appropriate drainage systems and diffuse connectivity across those tracks as very frequently, and then again diffuse discharge the other side. So you're not inhibiting that connection of groundwater across infrastructure. So just a little bit of understanding of how we expect it to go. Yes.
Thank you. So the monitoring commitments are vital to ensure that the various enhancement and restoration measures are achieved. As part of the moorland restoration and management plan, monitoring commitments have been included to measure the success of the plan. Firstly, post-construction surveys will be conducted of the restoration areas, including vegetation surveys as well as water monitoring using dip wells in pre-agreed quadrants. This will focus on assessing the vegetation present, the amount of ground cover and the depth of the water table to ensure the peatland is healthy and functioning. As well as the vegetation monitoring, fixed point photography monitoring has been included to provide a record of the change over time. The photography and vegetation quadrat points will be agreed post-consent with the council and will remain fixed over the lifetime of the monitoring. As well as this, an environmental clerk of works will be appointed by Cubico and approved by the planning authority. The environmental clerk of works will be present throughout the construction works and will supervise the peat excavation, translocation and restoration, as well as complete other required checks such as for protected species, water quality and traffic management. They will provide regular update reports to the LPA. And finally, a Habitat Management Group, or HMG, will be formed prior to construction. Similar groups have proven successful across many other wind farm sites, and it provides a team of people to oversee the restoration works. It would be chaired by the environmental clerk of works, and the HMG would include representatives from the council, Natural England, the applicant and landowners, as well as any other stakeholders who are interested in joining. All monitoring reports would be presented to the HMG, and it's proposed that they would meet annually to review the progress of the restoration works. So the outcome of the various restoration enhancement works that we've spoken about today will feed into both biodiversity and climate targets. Restoring the peatland will increase its ability to act as a carbon store, as well as improve water quality and support a wider range of plant and animal species. Also, all developments in England must now achieve 10% net gain as a statutory requirement. Moor will achieve this in addition to the peatland enhancements we have discussed. And as well as the restoration of the peatland, areas of poor condition grassland will be enhanced into a species-rich acid grassland, which will in turn enhance the site for many species such as invertebrates. I'm now going to pass over to Pete, who is going to wrap us up, I think.
Thanks, Jess. So just wanted to draw it all together and just sort of explain how the moorland restoration will be secured. So first and most importantly, all of the land that's needed for the moorland restoration and the biodiversity net gain is within our planning boundary and under our control with landowner agreements. Cubico's business model is to own and operate the site in the long term. This means that we would put the restoration works that need to be put in alongside the delivery of the wind farm from day one, but we would also be then managing the wind farm for its lifetime. So we'll be on site picking up on the points that Jess was just raising around monitoring, and if the sort of updates to the strategy would need to be taken, Cubico would be at the table, given our sort of long-term owner of the site and operator. However, I think that's just our word. I think alongside that, I think it's really important that we sort of show a commitment to the community and local planning authorities that this is something that will happen. So we are committed to putting a binding legal agreement in planning terms. That's called a Section 106 agreement, and that'll be tied to the planning permission, and it will secure the delivery of the restoration work. So and that will give the local planning authority powers to ensure that measures are delivered and monitored, and ultimately the wind turbines turned off if the scheme isn't achieving what it should be doing. And it also put in the ability for stakeholders to review the progress and feed into any future remedial work. Hopefully that answers that really important question. I think that brings us to a close, Ben. So it's now open to Q&A.
Thanks, Pete. Excuse me. Thanks, Pete, and thanks to the wider team for the presentation. Questions are coming through now, the Q&A facility, so we're very grateful for those, and we'll get onto them. But please do, if you've got any more questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll get through as many as we can. So the first question that we received is a more general question. It's, why do you call it Scout Moor when it's on Ruley Moor? Pete, I think you're probably best placed to answer this one.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, this is some feedback that we've had sort of before, and something that we've been listening to. Completely appreciate the sensitivities around the name, and completely recognise from a geographical perspective the site's located on Ruley Moor, but also Cartmoss and Bramwood Moor. Naming the scheme is something we did think about extensively. To be honest, with both of my daughters, I think wife and I took all the way to driving into the registry to register the birth. I think it was pretty much like this as well, that we had umpteen different names, and ultimately the team, we landed on Scout Moor 2. And I think the reason for that was it's a really well-known regional landmark, and we felt that connecting it to that scheme would just give everyone a reference point and allow local regional communities to kind of easily identify the project. I think what I would say is that's the name for a planning application. I think changing it at this point or going a different route would sort of give a lot of uncertainty to communities, given that we've already started the consultation, but we're not wedded to it. I think it's very much for the community to make a choice about that as the scheme. So if we're successful in securing a planning permission, I think we would be opening up to the community about if it's called Scoutmore 2 or something else. I mean, hopefully that explains the process. We went, obviously, it's a very subjective matter, and I'm sure we get lots of different views on it. So, but that's the reason why we went for Scoutmore.
Thank you, Pete. How can we be sure the restoration actually happens and it isn't just a promise?
Do you want me to say that as well, Ben? Just sort of, I mean, hopefully that last slide that's still up on the screen sort of explains that. I mean, we'll have binding sort of legal agreement there with the Section 106 agreement. I mean, first and foremost, this is a very important part of the scheme for Cubico. We see it very much as a dual application in the sense one half of it is the wind farm, but the other half of it is the moorland restoration and the B&G. And I think there are sort of very well trodden sort of planning mechanisms if it's Section 106 or also through planning conditions, and then B&G as well. It's still relatively new, but that has got I mean, Jess might be able to add to this in than where I'm going to on this, but essentially, yeah, we believe that there are mechanisms in place that will secure it in the long term, and also there's sort of as much of that is carrot, there'll be stick as well for us as the operator of the site to make sure that if things aren't working, that we get involved and put it right.
Thanks, Pete. Let's move on to the next question. How will this project deal with peat that's already been badly damaged?
I can pick that up initially, I guess. I think in the first instance, the sort of peat, there's something beyond badly damaged, which is gone, which is the peat that's in the quarry area that would have been there and has been lost to waste in some capacity in the past. And I think I won't go back to the slide, but that corner of the site is a good, I guess it's 20% of that plateau area that used to have peat on it and doesn't anymore. There's not peat sitting amongst the quarry waste anymore. That's gone. So first things first, we appreciate we will have to excavate some peat and move it around. That is going to be a requirement of the scheme. But there's an opportunity to essentially stop the site being broken up into two parts in that corner and connect the two elements together. At the moment, the peat sits on an island, the good quality example that we showed earlier. So there'll be opportunities to put that back together. I hope that the two sets of slides we talked about with drain blocking, gully reprofiling, and the plug planting and millennia management went some way towards discussing the existing damage. There are quite a lot of different types of existing damage on this site. Some of them are more complex to manage. The millennia, particularly, that is an area of innovation in the restoration community at present. But other things are very well established. So gully blocking delivers well, drain blocking delivers well, patch repair in small areas also delivers well. So these are things that we're confident we can make work. And a critical element of ensuring delivery is to specify a restoration contractor, so that there are construction contractors who are very good at building infrastructure, and there are restoration contractors who are very good at moving materials around and reinstating the ground carefully. And something like that could be built into the proposals for the habitat management group and potentially conditions, so that those sorts of things would really support delivery of that restoration work.
Thank you, Andy. Next question. Impact on the peat will go beyond the extent of any infrastructure, i.e. impact will be over a much bigger footprint as the peat will be affected beyond the point of contact. How will you how will you calculate the full extent of remediation required in these circumstances?
So I can answer that to some extent. So with excavations, there's fairly well understood distance that peat and contact would be affected by an excavation, and generally the approach is if you're looking at vehicle movements, and that it's beyond the edge of an excavation. You're not going to experience an effect through the associated watering beyond 10 meters of the side of your excavation. That's what it's based on, and yeah, any effect on that. Given that a lot of these areas we are looking to reinstate, so once the excavation, the temporary infrastructure has been served its purpose, then that material will be removed. Peat will be reinstated, improved along with the adjacent area. So in terms of the logical, geological effect of an excavation, that's the sort of what putting on letters. I think just with ecology, you use the same distance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So essentially, there's a direct impact. So that's footprints of infrastructure and works, and an indirect impact that's also assessed and within the EIA report. So when that's produced, there'll be an area in hectares of direct impact and an area in hectares of indirect impact, so indirect is, I think, specifically what this question is referring to, which is ground that's not physically altered, but sits adjacent to ground that is physically altered. And that's clearly calculated when pros and cons, if you like, of the scheme are put together to assess whether there's a significant impact. The balance between the direct and indirect impacts is compared with the amount of positive compensation work that's done in terms of restoration. And there is generally quite an onus on us as consultants to identify a large area of compensation to address the direct and indirect impacts associated with the wind farm.
Thank you very much, Andy. A question for Pete, I think. An attendee has asked, Cubico is for sale, isn't it? How will it own and operate it long term, or have any control over who does?
Cool, thanks, Ben. Yeah, what I would say is the sale process is ongoing, so I'm unable to comment on the specifics of that. But what I can say is we're a long-term owner, operator of renewable assets with a strong presence in the UK, and our business model is based on developing, owning, operating assets for long term, and we have no plans to change that approach. The development of Scoutmore 2 remains a key priority for the business, and if we're fully committed to ensure that the development goes forward as planned, and that's coming all the way from the top of Cubico, from chief officer level. So we do not see any impact on the Scoutmore 2 development regardless of any potential ownership changes. And while we cannot comment on the sales process, our focus remains firmly on executing our current plans.
Thank you, Pete. I had a question about decommissioning. What are the implications of decommissioning on all of this in 40 years' time? Will the moved peat be moved back, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a simple question to that one, Ben, in the sense that decommissioning will only relate to the wind farm element, essentially. So Moor restoration is going to be put in place. Part of that will be as part capital works that are put in place alongside the wind farm on day one, almost before the scheme goes operational. But then there'll be a management scheme over the next 40 years alongside the wind farm. So hopefully, in 40 years' time, you'll be seeing the fruits of all of that labour, and it's a very different environment up there after 40 years of moorland restoration. And clearly, we're not going to decommission moorland restoration works.
Thanks, Pete. We've got around 10 minutes of the webinar left. We've got a number of questions that we're still going to get to, but I would encourage everyone to submit any questions that they might have. There is the option to submit questions anonymously or to have them attributed to a name. If you submit them in your own name, then we've got your contact details through the registration of the webinar, and we can come back to you via email. If you submit them anonymously, then they will be addressed in the report that will accompany the planning application when that's submitted. Alternatively, you are able to email the project team. So let's have a look at the next question. Bear me one second. What are the impacts of the moorland restoration scheme on commoners and graziers, etc.?
So I think I can start with this one, if that's okay. So the moorland and the moorland management restoration plan has taken into account all of the current land uses. And initially, our areas that we're focusing on are the most degraded areas, which quite conveniently are largely outside of the common, on land that we're able to fence and control. So that's the main area that we're focusing on for our restoration plans. Other wider plans, such as the cutting of the linear and things like that, we will be looking to work with the graziers and getting them on board with these sort of lighter management, and sort of working across the moor with them as well.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the impact of things like brake dust, oil for turbines, maintenance, traffic, etc.? Now, these things are controlled as measured emissions for vehicles, so presumably also here?
I'll take that if you want, Ben. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's one that we sort of take into account. I mean, I think what is worth saying for like wind turbines, small amounts of oil, they're using gearboxes and hydraulics, but they're sealed systems, maintained a very high standard. So if the scheme's operational, essentially you'll be having sort of regular servicing of each turbine, as you would with a car or anything really. There'll be someone having a look at the gearboxes and everything, making sure everything's in good working order throughout the year. And any waste oils or anything like that will be disposed of in line with like strict environmental regulations. Brake dust isn't a significant issue because sort of wind turbines rely on sort of aerodynamic braking rather than mechanical brakes, but and they're only used in emergencies as well. So I think overall there will be sort of very strict regulation on all of those points. So it's very likely that there will be any accidents or spillages or stuff because of those risk management that will be put in place for our operation of the wind farm.
Thanks, Pete. A question that we've had through: turning the turbine off if you don't meet the objectives is a bit pointless, isn't it? The damage would already be done. Andy?
Yeah, so if I could chip in on this one. So obviously Jess was talking about monitoring, fixed point photography, quadrat surveys, etc. We don't just watch it and hang our heads if it's not working. Part of the habitat management plan is to put in place mitigation proposals for if things don't go quite towards the trajectory we're looking for. So there will be targets that we're aiming to achieve, and there'll be mitigation put in place to address shortcomings in delivery if that happens. Now, these could happen for a variety of reasons. It could happen because the work is done immediately before a particularly severe period of drought or some sort of climate event, a couple of dry years where things don't take properly, or we could have a moor fire in an area where we're doing work which wasn't planned. I don't mean in association with a wind farm, but sometimes these things can happen. So that might affect our attempts to do something in a particular area, and then we'd need to do remedial work to accommodate that. So part of the habitat management proposals are not that all the work is done at the front and then no work is done through the operational life of the wind farm. Part of the habitat management proposals are to ensure that there's a flowchart approach to managing any deviations from what is proposed. So we wouldn't really regard failing to meet objectives as a thing that would happen. We would just have to come in and do some more work to bring that back in line. And that's not dissimilar to Peatland Code projects. So some of you may have heard of Peatland Code, which is a funded mechanism for generating carbon credits from peat restoration. All that money that comes with that sort of work doesn't just get allocated as soon as the first tranche of work is done. The sites are audited repeatedly over decades to ensure that they deliver what they promise. And unless they're delivered, all of the code funding isn't necessarily released. So, there is a requirement on peatland restoration in many contexts to ensure delivery over longer periods. And that's no different for a wind farm as it is for other contexts.
Thank you very much,
Well,
Andy. Oh, sorry.
Ben, I just want to pick in. I think one of the question there was about the turbines being switched off as well. And I think we need to look at like the exact wording of planning conditions or the legal condition. I mean, ultimately that is the very, very end of because obviously that's something that we would never want to get to anyway. So I mean, ultimately that's the stick, isn't it, for the developer or the operator. I think all of this is about making sure that I think we've said through this presentation earlier on about we're not suggesting something here which is novel or new. Like this is all on tried and tested techniques that are being used across the country, and there's evidence, academic evidence for that, as well as sort of observed evidence as well. If you go up to the wind farm at Blacklaw as well in particular, so we will need to look with the local planning authority and Natural England at the exact terms of a planning condition when we get to that stage. I think it is right that there's a stick element to that ultimately, but we would never want to get to that part of that backstop bit of the condition. Ultimately, we'll be doing stuff here that is evidence. We'll be doing stuff up front. We'll be monitoring it, and then if we're on course, great. If we're off course, we react and remediation works are made, and then you get back on track, and you do that together as well, working through the HM, the Habitat Management Group, with Natural England being the table, with ourselves being the table, with the local authorities being the table, with the commoners being the table, and you work in partnership to make sure that this happens, so that when we're I'll probably be in my 80s, but when we're sat here in 40 years' time, hopefully we're looking at a very successful moorland restoration project.
Thank you very much, Pete. Hopefully we've got time for a couple more questions. So Duncan, I think this is probably one for you regarding the volume of peat. What volume of peat will you be moving / removing / restoring / losing, etc.?
Yeah, we're still refining those numbers at the moment, because obviously we're looking for the best out and methods possible to avoid us excavating as much peat as we can. However, looking at the reuse opportunities, what we can say is all the excavated peat we will be able to reuse on site as part of the restoration program. So whether that's within those temporary infrastructure areas that we would reinstate, or any other moorland restoration areas, it'll all be staying on site. No requirements taken.
Thank you, Duncan. And probably the last question we've got time for this evening. As I mentioned, other questions that have been submitted will be addressed through the statement of community involvement. Why do you need a wind farm to do moorland restoration? Andy, I think you're probably best for this.
Yeah, so you can do moorland restoration without a wind farm, but you can only do some of the restoration. So the drain and gully blocking is a restoration activities you can do without donor peat. Same with some of the millennium management, but reinstating peat in areas where it's gone, which is certainly the case in the western part of the site where the better habitats are located. You actually need donor peat to be able to use, and it's a happy coincidence in some ways that wind farms do generate that material, and that's the case in many wind farm developments, particularly in eroded areas of Scotland and in some parts of Wales as well. The other answer to that question is that there simply isn't enough public funding to restore all the bogs in the UK, because there's a lot of them. And where funding tends to be allocated is to the low-hanging fruit. So that's the sites that are very heavily drained or very heavily gullied, which means that those draw the funding and other sites don't. And in many cases, particularly in Scotland and Wales and now England, wind farms are picking up their share of the restoration and undertaking that work. There was another question to do with income for that, and there's something called additionality where you can't claim twice. So any restoration work done as part of this is part of the compensation. and that's all. So it's delivered purely to compensate the impacts of compensate for the impacts of the wind farm and no other capacity.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy. And as we're approaching 7 o'clock, that brings our webinar to an end this evening. I want to take the opportunity to thank Pete, Andy, Jess, and Duncan for their time, and thank you to all attendees and those watching the recording for giving up the time to learn more about the project. As noted at the top of the webinar, this session tonight is one part of a wider programme of community consultation events. In addition to the 3 exhibitions and 1 technical webinar that has already taken place, we have more events coming up after the long weekend. On Wednesday, the 23rd of April, we're at Calp Community Hall, and on Thursday, the 24th of April, we'll be at Edenfield Community Centre. Both of these events begin at 1:30 and run until 7 p.m. And then on Friday, the 25th of April, we'll be hosting a final technical webinar on access and infrastructure. That will begin at 6 p.m. And if you haven't already, you can register for that session on our website. Our community consultation runs until the 29th of April, and I hope that everyone who has not done so already will provide their feedback via the online form or by completing a form at one of our exhibitions. Our website is www.scoutmore2.co.uk, and you can contact the team via email at scoutmore2@havingyoursay.co.uk or via phone on 0333 358 0502. All that information and much, much more is available on our website. That concludes our session this evening. We want to wish everyone a very happy Easter and look forward to continued engagement after the holidays. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.